Welcome everyone to the first of 3 timeline theory / discussion videos for Breath of the Wild that I'm releasing this week. In the past I've put up a theory video about how I thought Breath of the Wild takes place at the start of the Downfall timeline. If you want to know more about that theory, go check out that video. Today, however, we're talking about the possibility of Breath of the Wild taking place at the end of the Downfall timeline after Zelda 2, Adventure of Link. A theory for the placement of Breath of the Wild being at the end of the Downfall timeline, which I'm calling Downfall's cusp, stems from a few statements made by developers and specific things we've seen in trailers and gameplay. We've heard the developers say a few times that Breath of the Wild takes place in a Hyrule ravaged by multiple attacks by Ganon. The Downfall timeline has a myriad of attacks, from A Link to the Past all the way to the original Legend of Zelda, and its sequel Adventure of Link where his followers try to revive him as well. The official timeline also refers to this period of time at the end of the Downfall timeline as the Era of Decline. It's very possible that after Link reclaims the Triforce at the end of Adventure of Link, that the world enters an era of prosperity, and the Kingdom of Hyrule begins to flourish again before being beaten back down by Calamity Ganon, thus beginning the events 100 years before the main game of Breath of the Wild. Now this is why I'm calling this theory Downfall's cusp, using the noun cusp here to describe the transition between two different states of Hyrule. The flourishing Hyrule before the attack of Ganon, one that's pulled itself back from the brink of numerous attacks, and one that we see while playing Breath of the Wild 100 years later, where it's mostly in ruin with small settlements dotting the land and nothing more. Some of the other points brought up for this placement in the timeline is the location of the Master Sword, deep in the woods as first seen in A Link to the Past, and its geographical placement reoccurs actually a few times throughout the Downfall timeline. The general similarities between Breath of the Wild and Zelda 1, however, are some of the strongest points this theory has going for it. Nintendo has been using a lot of similar imagery when showing off the game, which shows familiar landmarks from a lot of the original art for that game, and we've also heard developers talk about how this is the first time the freedom of that game has returned to the Zelda series in a long time. However, as we all know, no timeline placement is right yet. We're just over a week away from diving into Breath of the Wild ourselves and hopefully discovering firsthand which timeline it takes place in. So let's look at some of the points which suggest it couldn't take place at the end of the Downfall timeline. One of these arguments against this placement is the fact we've seen Hyrule in such a prosperous state, one with a huge city and castles similar to that we've seen in Twilight Princess, while most of the Downfall timeline itself is bleak and regularly attacked, one which has very little time for advancement. Another well-documented argument against this placement is that after Adventure of Link, Ganon is dead. He isn't resurrected. So, how or what is the Calamity Ganon? I believe it could very well be the embodiment of this curse, this repeating evil that demise set on the hero and those who follow him in Skyward Sword. But an embodiment with no body to inhabit. We've always seen this evil manifest in the body of a villain, most commonly Ganondorf, also known as Ganon. Maybe this is just a way for it to carry out its task, its lust for the Triforce and its rightful ownership of the Triforce of Power. However, what if it didn't have a vessel? Would it still manifest itself but in a more unrestricted, raw, oozing evil that swarmed and covered the world in darkness? Only time will tell, but this idea could technically apply itself to a timeline placement at the ends of any timeline, as Ganondorf/Ganon dies in all 3, technically. We're getting ever closer to the release of Breath of the Wild, and in no time at all, we'll all know where this game sits in the timeline, but until then it's fun to speculate, theorise, debate, or it may sit in the grander story of The Legend of Zelda. Thank you all for watching, and I'm very excited to find out more about Breath of the Wild on March 3rd. Check back tomorrow for a look at the possible placements of Breath of the Wild in the child timeline, and arguments brought up as why it could or couldn't take place there. Thank you all for watching, and see you then.